Welcome to another episode of the Innovation Foundation for Democracy, where we discuss ideas of democracy. Today we're joined by Carilee Osborne, who is a PhD candidate at Brown University, the Department of Sociology. Carilee, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I want to open this by getting your reflections on the 30 years of democracy, particularly around the question of the promises of a better life for all.
Yeah. I feel like it's almost become a cliche to say that it's a contradictory process, right? When you talk about South Africa, you're always kind of talking about contradictions, right? On the one hand, when we think about it, I think there really have been like massive changes in the post-apartheid period, right? In people's, very most obviously in people's political rights, in their civil rights, and their social rights. But also I think, there have been some material gains in the post-apartheid period, and in particular in the early post-apartheid period, I think we saw some of that in the area I'm most familiar with, which is the provision of social security and South Africa social grants. You've really seen that. South Africa has the not so coveted prize of being one of the most unequal countries in the world, some of the highest unemployment rates, some of the highest poverty rates, and I think those socioeconomic things really start to threaten the legitimacy of the democratic system, right? And we see that in the declining turnout for elections, right? We see that in a kind of malaise and somehow in the way in which people are engaging in democracy. You see that in the rise of some political parties like MK, right, which are calling into question the entire post-apartheid project with the anti-constitutionalism and all of that. And, they gained a lot of support. And so I think we need to really understand the moment that we're in, both acknowledging the real progress that's been made and some of the resilience of South African democracy and some South Africa's democratic institutions, whilst also taking very seriously the fact that if we don't see real gains, then that system can be under threat, right? The legitimacy of it.
Yeah, and back on the question of grants again. They have become kind of like a centerpiece in terms of the post-apartheid. I think the numbers show that pre-94, there was very little in terms of on the income profile. There's very little on grants. And then the post-apartheid, that kind of went up, where a large part of the society is basically relying on social grants. I'm wondering if you can talk to that
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess just it helps to descriptively, tell that story a little bit. During the sort of colonial or the pre-apartheid, the immediate pre-apartheid and apartheid period, South Africa did have some kinds of income support, right? We've had income support in South Africa since about the 1920s, but obviously this was highly unequal and racialized. And, in the beginning, I think was very much meant to protect the kind of small group of white South Africans who were poor, right? And were not being held up by the very many other laws that were being held, propping up white South Africans. Over time, there was some racial equalization, right? But not enough. And obviously, the very complex governing structure of the kind of homelands system meant that you had this very fragmented social welfare system that was deeply unequal. And also not just unequal racially, but based on, very particular ideas about the family, for example. So one of the primary grants you had during the apartheid period was called the state maintenance grant. And basically only single mothers who could prove that the father of their children, their husbands, had either died or left them or were not paying maintenance, were the only ones who could really access that, right? So those are also other ways in which the welfare state was embodying different kinds of beliefs and principles. When the ANC came into power, and during the kind of transition when the ANC came into power, they had to decide what they wanted to do about social welfare. And I think it's really interesting because the ANC was very much committed to the role of the state in providing social security, providing social assistance, and providing, social welfare. We see that in, the provision of housing, the provision of, the expansion of education, the provisions on health. But the question was, what do you do with these existing cash transfer programs that we have? And what do we do for people who are unable to provide for themselves outside of the sort of income, from labor? And basically, through a whole lot of processes, the ANC decided that it was going to keep some parts of the social grant system in place. So we have an old age pension, right? But I think what's really interesting is the way in which the state maintenance grant was converted into what we now know as the child support grant, right? And what you really see if you look at it, so if you look at a graph of the expansion of social grants in the post-apartheid period, you see very much a relatively rapid increase, especially between about 2000 and 2008. And then a sort of tapering off at a high level, and then from COVID, a spike again. And there's a really great graph in a piece by Daniel Stein, I think, in Ground Up from last year, which shows this graph. So I really recommend people go and look at that. And it has kind of different colors that represent the different graph. And I think it's really useful because basically until 2020, it was almost all the same colors, right, on the graph. We didn't introduce a lot of new grants. Mostly the changes were coming from an increase in the the number of people receiving the child support grant. And basically how that came was through changing eligibility requirements. And so, and largely increasing the age at which children were eligible to receive grants. Obviously the grants are paid to the caregivers on behalf of children. So it now goes up to the age of 18. And basically the decisions that were made by this sort of process between civil society and the state, negotiating and setting policy, was that what we were going to do is target a kind of, what's the phrase people use, width over depth, or width over breadth. I'm not basically we're going to bring more people into the social security system, but we're not really going to increase the level of the benefit. It really just gets increased with inflation, right? What's driving the increase in spending on social grants, what's driving this is changing eligibility requirements and saying, we're going to bring more children. Everyone under the age of 18 now can receive this if they fall below a poverty line. And then, of course, the last spike that we get is the introduction of the COVID Social Relief of Distress Grant, which now has been extended until at least next year. That'll be 5 years. And that was really the first time in a democratic South Africa that able-bodied working age people were able to receive support from the state. So that really tells you the picture of that. And, depending on the month, because the COVID SRD grant beneficiaries change by every month, and depending on how you think about the population, it's, between 42 and 47% of the population receive a grant. So there's massive, and they're highly redistributive, and they're really, really important to having reduced poverty levels.
I like that you bring the 350 rands, the SRD grant, because it came at a time where I think the idea of a grant was already under question in terms of it's a welfare state, and the idea that it has turned Black people lazy because they're now relying on grants. But at the same time, South Africa has always been a welfare state. So I'm wondering if we can talk again back into the impact of that SRD grant, because I know there were contestations also in terms of whether it should be extended or not. I don't know if you can talk to that one particularly.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, firstly, on the sort of laziness dependency thing, that's a very common critique of all kinds of social assistance, but in particular of cash transfers, income support around the world. You see a lot of people putting forward this idea that if you're going to promise money to people, they're not going to work, right? And I think firstly, it seems absurd to me, 350 Rand. I don't think there's very many people who would say, I don't want to work so I can get 350 Rand, right? If we think of what the minimum wage is, if we think about that, it's kind of an absurd idea. Firstly, just on those grounds. But secondly, there have been many, many empirical studies that show that giving people this money does not disincentivize work. And in fact, in the South African case, studies have shown that there can even be a small improvement in labor market outcomes, right? Because sometimes what happens is people don't have money to go travel to get a job, right? They don't have money to maybe invest in, a small amount of vegetables that they can sell on, right? And that if you give people this, it can actually improve some labor market outcomes, right? There's a good paper for people who want to look at this research in more detail by the Institute for Economic Justice, which outlines this debate and shows some of the empirical research on it. But I think that this idea, right, is very influential in South Africa, and it's very influential within the ANC, right, as our dominant political party. There's a lot of people within the ANC, I think, who still believe this about grants and believe this about social grants in the 90s, which is why there was this whole debate about, what are we going to do about social grants? And the purpose of sort of development was seen to be moving people off the social security system, which we haven't seen, right? So I think there's a kind of tension there, right? And that idea feeds into, people's perceptions of social grants. I think it's kind of strange when you consider the fact that most of the people who've been receiving grants in the post-apartheid period are old people and children. Those are not people that we want to be working, right? They're not meant to be working. And the second thing is with the COVID grant, the assumption, if you criticize giving a grant like the Social Relief of Distress grant on the ground that it's going to disincentivize work, you're assuming that there's work out there and people just aren't pursuing it. I mean, we live in a country with some of the highest unemployment rates in the world, and it's persistent, structural unemployment, right? So it's not like there's a whole lot of jobs that are waiting to be filled in South Africa. That's not the case, right? So I think that whole argument just doesn't make sense, right? But I think it is an important thing to grapple with because it's a very important part of the, policy sphere. And it's also, I think, something that has meant we maybe haven't celebrated this massive expansion in social security in the way that we would. If you look in Brazil, they have this very famous policy called Bolsa Familia, right? Lula and other politicians, they campaign on that. They say, this is this amazing thing that we've done. And I think here you don't see it as much, right? You see it a bit, but you don't see it as much. And I think it's because we have these ideas that it's not a massive achievement, that we have brought all these people, that we're able to provide this, that we were able to, reduce poverty rates so much, and that the state has the capacity, to get this money to people every month.
To do that, Well, that's such a powerful point that you bring, because South Africa has, I think, and again, you can correct me here, the most sophisticated system of social transfer in the world, where it ranks right there up with the others from other parts of the world. And so the idea that it's not celebrated is a tricky one, because I think that there's a way that the idea of social transfer can sit right there within the reparative discourse or kind of like the redistribution discourse. I'm wondering if you can talk to that and why this hasn't really gotten the respect that it deserves.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And there's obviously a lot of reasons, right? Because as you say, I don't know about sophistication, but South Africa, it's one of the most redistributive grant systems in the world and one of the largest, right? If we adjust for population. So it is, and it's had all these positive effects. I would say there's a couple of things in this, right? One is about the design of the grant, right? And how we think about what the grant is. So it's really interesting if you read the memoirs or the reports of people who were part of designing the child support grant in particular. They didn't want to call it a grant. They wanted to call it a benefit, right? They wanted to say this is a benefit that you get. And I think that even that shift in language, right, where you're like, this is something that I am entitled to as a citizen of this country, right, or as a resident of this country, changes the way in which you think about it. The idea of grants, right, has come to mean a particular kind of thing that's not something that people have earned. It's something that, it's a handout, something we give to them. So there's something that's happening maybe at the level of discourse and how those things are constructed. I also think that the way in which the grants have been designed plays into these ideas. So again, if you go back to the people who were designing the child support grant, they wanted to make the grant universal, right? So they wanted to say, anyone is entitled to get this grant, children in this case are entitled to get this grant regardless of their income levels, right? This is a thing that we think you benefit from being children. Of course, the idea was that, people who are wealthy enough are not going to take the time to sign up for a relatively small grant, right? And so you're really going to target the people who want that grant. But what that does when you have a universal benefit is it doesn't mean that it's a marker of poverty, right? It's seen as something that we are entitled to by virtue of, being who we are in this country. And so I think it was probably a mistake, right, to not, design this as being something that's like a benefit that we're all entitled to by virtue of being here. So I think that plays into it, right? And of course, like, it's an interesting thing, you use the word like reparative, is that it's not really framed in that way, right? Even though the grant is highly redistributive from the top income decile and to the bottom, right? So that is a way in which you're acknowledging this like massive wealth inequality, which we know is highly racialized in this country. But instead, it's almost seen in this like, you get people saying things like, oh, taxpayers fund this, taxpayers fund that, right? So there's a way in which I think government has missed an opportunity to talk about grants in a different way, right? Yeah. And to not think about it in that way. And there's obviously a long global problem with like viewing welfare in these negative ways, as you spoke about earlier. So in that way, we're not an exception, right? It's so there's like that's just a problem that we face in thinking about this. Yeah. But it's also, there are also local things that I think could have been done slightly differently to create slightly different ways in which we think about, what these things are.
Yeah. Is there anything wrong with being called a welfare state?
I mean, not in my opinion, right? Not in my opinion. Like, I think people, if you look at the kind of classical welfare states of like Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, they're held up, right, as these like incredible like bastions of social democracy and what they do for people, and the life that they're able to provide for people and the kind of quality of life people lead, by living there. And so I think that that's something you should aspire to, right? To be that kind of welfare state. Of course, the thing is, what those countries did is they also built that welfare state whilst like growing their economy and providing employment and building all sorts of social security, social assistance, social insurance policies. Of course, big part is public services, free, universal, well-funded public services, right? So we need all of those parts of the welfare state, not just one part. But in my opinion, a welfare state like that is something we should aspire to, not something we should, run away from. But that hasn't, I think, always been the way in which it's thought about. Yeah.
Coming back to the South African case, I mean, right now we have the government of national unity. And you just made an example of how actually in Brazil they campaign on these things. But there's a way of speaking about welfare in South Africa that becomes negative. I mean, you had one party noticed recently saying that they will scrap the basic
minimum wage.
The minimum wage. Yeah. And of course, I mean, you saw these new security, these protection. I think you had quite a few here in Johannesburg where these are part of protection services, like they're taking the youth and giving them these jobs. Right. But these things, the danger of campaigning around these points, particularly in our democracy. I know you mentioned them in Brazil as something that has happened, but what are the dangers of actually playing around these points of welfare system, whether you take them out when you come in government or you campaign on them as something that you will extend? Yeah.
So I think that's a really good point, because in some places, right, social grants or any kinds of sort of government, any kinds of welfare can be used for sort of like political patronage, right? Where you are saying, if you vote for us, you will get this, right? Like, if you vote for us, you'll get this, or if you don't vote for us, you're going to lose this, right? So I guess there's a couple of different things. One is you need to design policies that are programmatic, right? That it's like everyone is entitled to these programs. It's not dependent on like where you live, because if it's dependent on where you live, you can see what election data comes out of where someone lives, right? And so you could make that. And it's about not giving too much discretion to politicians or bureaucrats around who gets or doesn't get these grants, right? One of the benefits of universal programs, right, is that they're not making decisions about who does and doesn't get these grants, right? So that's one part of it. Of course, and so what you don't want is to allow political parties to campaign on promises also that might not come through, or to tell people, if you don't vote for us, these things are going to get taken away, right? So I think that's the danger of it being, of welfare policies being used as a kind of electioneering, like sloganing and all of that, right? And the way in which you get around that is you've got to build these programmatically, and you've got to like put the institutional basis for them, and to not allow them to be tools of political parties. And I think that also, you know, speaking about democracy, it also requires us having a kind of rigorous civil society, or like groups outside of the state who are making sure that these policies are not being, you know, lost or used like in this way.
I want to bring in something else here, because again with that, and again earlier when I mentioned South Africa's this very tight system of social transfers, because I'm looking at how even within local government there's if there's floods or there's disasters, there is that room where local governments have learned to quickly respond to, whether it's through food parcels, whether it's through those short-term grants where they can extend this. But I think this equally created a space where civil society or NGOs can come in and play in that space. I wonder if you can talk around that part of that exchange where NGOs have become an extension of the welfare system, the government welfare system, and that exchange. What does it mean for a democracy like this?
It's a really good question, and I sort of haven't fully developed my thoughts on this, but I think there's like two things which maybe pull in different directions. The one, right, which I think is what you're sort of referencing here, is the fact that NGOs, right, have become agents of the welfare state, which you see this a lot, right, with the Department of Social Development outsourcing to NGOs, right, various functions, distribution of food parcels, for example, or whatever, a whole lot of things. And you see the way in which this can have really dire impacts. I mean, the Life Isidimeni thing, right, with the Department of Health, was a moving people from a professional facility to NGOs that were completely unaccountable and unable to do what they did. And that resulted in the loss of very many lives, right? And so I think we should be really careful about, you know, people always talk about the negative implications of outsourcing to companies, right? But there can very similarly be negative implications of outsourcing to NGOs, right? Both in terms of reduction in state capacity, but also in the fact that NGOs are not held accountable in the same way as the state is. And so I think that creates really significant problems that we need to address, right? On the other hand, you know, there's all different types of civil society groups, and there's a lot of people, a lot of sociologists and political scientists who have talked about the way in which a strong relationship between the state and society can create what some people have called the political foundations of state effectiveness. So this is Peter Evans and Evelyn Huber and John Stevens' argument about the way in which one part of state effectiveness is building these strong ties into society. And the development of the Scandinavian, the Northern European welfare states was about, you know, the strong linkages between trade unions, the creation of left political parties, right? And that's how you created these really strong welfare states, right? In India, in the state of Kerala, for example, you have another kind of model of civil society and the state creating a sort of state policies that vastly outstrip the sort of resources at the state. So, sorry, I didn't explain that very well, but Kerala is a very poor state, but has a really much higher standards of living, right, on all the conventional metrics of human development. And people have talked about, including the person who's my advisor, Patrick Heller, about the way in which like that sort of strong civil society state relationship, right, has been part of why they have such a strong human development index relative to their like GDP, right, GDP per capita.
Yeah.
So I think we need to think about how civil society can strengthen the state rather than drain resources from the state, and think about that relationship very carefully and put in place policies that are able to do that.
Yeah, that's a really a powerful point you make, because another thought that I wanted you to speak into is how the civic society kind of like replay the corporate or the business society logics in terms of how they deal with the government.
Yeah.
You know, either in trying to kind of like drain or try to kind of I don't know, but there's this relationship that I can't really pin down because it's not really it's kind of back and forth.
Yeah.
You know, because you need the civic society. But in the case of South Africa, for instance, the post of apartheid has been characterized by this kind of like social justice industrial complex where the civic society it gives language to that kind of like social justice discourse. So I'm wondering your thought in terms of the relationship. What kind of relationship do you think the civic society can and should have with the government?
I mean, obviously, you know, I've worked in civil society organizations. I have seen the really strong benefit of civil society organizations, right? But I think you're right that there's a risk to this, and there's for very many reasons, you know, civil society groups are not always, we shouldn't think of them as always positive, like in a normatively positive sense, right? If we think about you know, what role does it have and what role can it have, and maybe separate those two things out. You know, in South Africa, what role it does have is very varied, right? We have so many different types of civil society actors. I mean, we might say that some business lobbies, BLSA, Business Unity, South Africa, all of that are kind of civil society group in some ways, right? They're they're a collective of people with particular interests, and they lobby government and they have a role to play there. So we have those. We have these, you know, highly resourced. I want like a better word, but like elite NGOs, right? Like places like where I have worked, where they're well funded. Many of the people who work there are like extremely well educated, you know, especially in the South African context. I mean, people have PhDs, they have, you know, they really are very well resourced in many ways, and they have very strong connections to government. Often as a result, I think, of sort of anti-apartheid struggles, right? Like, and links to people who were in the anti-apartheid movement who are in the state. But then you also have social movements, right? And many social movements who do not get the same kind of treatment that elite civil society actors get from the state, right? Who are repressed, killed, you know, a whole lot of things. I mean, we see what happens with a lot of civil society groups in KZN, right? Abahlali in particular, right? So we have all these different things. So to characterize, and we also have different kinds of civil society groups like AfriForum, right? Or like groups that are really interested in the kind of very narrow, maybe ethno or religious interests of like small groups, you know? So we have this huge range of civil society organizations. And so it's very difficult to characterize, you know, one type of relationship of them, you know, to the state. But I think what I think it should be, right, I guess, goes back to the previous answer about civil society groups should be both strengthening the state's capacity and holding the state like accountable, right? That's the sort of, I think, some of the classical ideas about the role of civil society. And we should be very clear not to be, you know, using civil society as a stand-in for the state, but rather trying to get it to strengthen the state, to hold the state accountable, and to also ensure that civil society is being held accountable. You know, that's also like really important. And then in thinking back on the ideas of social democracy as an imagined alternative to this moment, because there is an idea of the crisis of democracy or a democracy in crisis, and in imagining alternatives
I think social democracy comes up, but I want you maybe to speak to that by way of the universal income grant that has been back and forth in terms of like the debate around it, and just your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So like, I mean, absolutely. I think, building a social democracy has been something that, an aspiration for many people in South Africa. And I think that's, to me, that's what I want to live in, whether we call it a social democracy or like democratic socialism and what those boundaries are between those, right? Like, I want to live in a country where you have, where you have these kinds of, where we start to limit the role of the market in the provision of like, basic things that we need to thrive as human beings, and but we still maintain these kind of democratic principles, and we still maintain the importance of democracy, because I think that's important. The role of basic income, universal basic income, in that is such a like difficult thing, right? Because I think UBI is such an interesting policy because it attracts support from such different people, right? So you have Silicon Valley, entrepreneurs, tech entrepreneurs promoting it. You have, very like sort of far right or like, libertarian economists promoting it, but you also have it as a demand of the left, right? And it's like, what is going on, right? Like, what's going on here? Like, I'm not sure there are that many policies where you can see such divergent people calling for the same thing. And I think that is because the answer to me, as someone who is on the left, right, is that you want universal basic income in addition to all of these other things, not as a substitute for them, right? So there is one vision of universal basic income that sees it as a way out of social democracy, right? As a way to roll back the welfare state, to cut all kinds of public services, free education, free healthcare, and give people an income, and they must buy all those things on the market, right? So there's one version of universal basic income that is exactly the way out of social democracy, right? And the rolling back of the welfare state. And then there's another vision of universal basic income, which sees it as a kind of, various things. One, as a supplement to all of those other things, building out universal public services and all of that, free public services, or as a kind of interim measure on the pathway to that. So we need this now because there's a way in which it's easier to build out a universal basic income than it is to ensure we have good healthcare or democracy. They're more complex public goods to provide. So some people see it as on a pathway to that, right? So there's these kind of different ways in which we can think about the relationship between universal basic income and social democracy or the welfare state. And I think a lot of that depends on your politics, right? And depends on how you see this. And maybe as a way out, I'd like to hear your reflections on this new government of national unity, and what what do the futures look like for a democracy like ours, where you have a large population that rely on the welfare, and the future kind of like democracies are trying to say, well, let's roll this back, let's cut this back. So what reflecting on this current administration, and what are the futures look like on welfare? I think my view on the Government of National Unity is this is like, the best of the worst options, So I think I don't want to quote Winston Churchill, but he's like, says something like, democracy is the worst system except for all the other ones we've tried, right? And I think there's a sense in which with the Government of National Unity, there's a sense in which it was pulled together to create some sort of stability, which I think is important. Was obviously also pulled together to keep out what I consider to be right-wing forces like MK, right? Like I see that as the kinds of policies that they're promoting are a return to like a new feudal system in which, patriarchal relations are, kind of like constitute part of that. And I do believe, whilst, I don't think the Constitution is a panacea, I do think that there's, a reason why people wanted to have a constitutional democracy. And so if you read MK's manifesto and you see that as a rolling back of all of those things, I think it was important for us to have a government that was going to prevent, a party like that from being in power. And I think that there's no doubt that political stability is important. And if we're going to have economic growth and all of these things, which, we do need to have in order to have all these other things we want, this was important. At the same time, of course, it's like deeply, deeply concerning that you now have ministers from the DA in power who want to remove minimum wages, right? Like that's a deeply worrying thing that goes against, everything I stand for, right? As a person. And, that you have people in government who have expressed, quite like abhorrent views about foreigners, about workers and what the working class, so this is a very hard pill to swallow. And I understand why for left-wing forces in this country, this is a very hard pill to swallow, right? It's a very hard pill to swallow. And it's really bad that we are in the situation that this is what was the way to have stability, right? It's bad that we got to this point. I think looking forward, and in particular, if we're talking about how do we protect the gains of what we have had, the maybe little gains, or the inadequate, I should say, gains, it's about building a kind of counter force, right, within society, and building, left political power, and like reinvigorating the working class and the trade unions, and that in order, that's, again, you learn from history and you learn from like comparative work, that's how these welfare states were built. That's how social democracy was built, through the power of labor over capital, right? Yeah. And if that's what we want, we need to use this time of relative stability in terms of the GNU, and I say relative, I really mean that, this is a tenuous thing. And for many people in South Africa, their lives have not changed, their lives have not materially changed by having the JSE going up or the thing, but it is a period of relative stability. But we need to use that, and we need to advocate for all of these other kinds of policies. We need to advocate for policies that are really going to grow jobs, that are really going to create jobs. Right? We need to advocate for an end to austerity policies, right? We need to advocate for an expansion of universal public services and holding, corporations and capital to account. So we need to use that, and that's the only way in which we prevent this being something that we look back on in 10 years' time and think that was the moment where things really, went down.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your insight.
Thank you.
That was really insightful.
Thanks.
So
thank you. Thanks for your questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for joining us. And remember to like, to share, and to subscribe. Thank you.